Today we are going to talk about the Affordable Care Act and U.S. health reform. I have a very simple goal. I want to make you one of the smartest people in the United States in terms of understanding the ACA and health reform in the United States. Unfortunately, because there's so much misunderstanding about this law, it's not a hard thing to do to make you particularly knowledgeable. But let's start and go back to our course metaphor of the forest and the trees. Let's look at the tree with the 5 essential branches: the patients, the providers, the payers, the purchasers, and the policymakers. Everything in the Affordable Care Act touches and changes in important ways the rest of the branches, the other 4 branches. So we're talking about policy, pure policy making here, and giving you the story behind it. And we're going to start by talking about the history of health reform in the United States. It's a long history and an interesting one. It starts going back to over 100 years ago with Teddy Roosevelt. He was no longer president. He had given up his office, but he decided in 1912 to run again. And he didn't run as a Republican. He ran from a new party called the Bull Moose Party. And he made one of his central platforms that year the creation of some kind of a system to provide health security or health insurance to all Americans. He didn't get elected, and his effort petered away very quickly. Other people took up the cause, but that was the first effort when there was a real national conversation about it. It didn't really reemerge into the landscape until the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was president. President Roosevelt, when he was developing the Social Security law that was signed in 1935, initially wanted to include health insurance for all Americans as part of that. He had some significant resistance from the medical community, the American Medical Association, and other groups, and had to leave health insurance aside or he feared he wouldn't get anything through. And so health care did not become part of the original Social Security Act. Later in his administration, in the mid-1940s, President Roosevelt, seeing the end of World War II in sight, decided that this would be an important moment when we might perhaps be able to achieve health security in addition to Social Security. He had his aides work up a version of legislation that would create health insurance for all Americans. Before he could move that, he died in April 1945, and his successor, Harry Truman, picked up his proposal and made it one of his major initiatives as he was dealing with Congress during his presidency. He tried very hard, and he had support in Congress, and not nearly enough. And so this was an attempt to create a genuinely national health system, not just health insurance, but the provider community as well would all be part of a single uniform system. He ran into opposition again from the physician community and the American Medical Association. He also ran into accusations that this was socialistic, this was communist. This was an era where there was a lot of concern because of the rising power of the Soviet Union, and those fears were used to try to undermine the support of President Truman's initiative, and he completely failed to be able to move any legislation through Congress. In the last part of his administration in the early 1950s, he agreed with some of his aides that maybe it was time to look at just starting by trying to provide health insurance coverage for all elderly Americans. And they never were able to move it far, but that became the roots of what turned into a significant success in the 1960s. So you can see in our slide the picture of Lyndon Johnson in 1965 signing the law that created the Medicare and Medicaid program. You'll be learning a lot more about Medicare and Medicaid in coming weeks. You can see over on the right of the picture, there is President Truman watching President Lyndon Johnson sign that law. That was the most significant accomplishment in health reform in the United States. and until the Affordable Care Act. And one could argue which is more significant, but those are the two most significant health reform landmarks. Now, Medicare created some health insurance security for most senior citizens, and Medicaid originally created some health security for low-income, mostly women and children on public assistance. Over time, those programs have changed and expanded, but in terms of covering the rest of the population and creating health insurance security for everyone, that was not achieved as part of Lyndon Johnson's success in 1965. The next person who took up that issue was in the early 1970s and President Richard Nixon. President Nixon moved away from trying to create a government program like Medicare or Medicaid, and for the first time proposed a health insurance expansion that would have required the involvement of private health insurance and mandating employers to provide health insurance to their workers, individuals to have to buy it. It was an ambitious effort, and in 1974, Richard Nixon's presidency ended as he became enmeshed in what was known as the Watergate scandal. And so that whole episode of reform ended with nothing happening. There were various efforts. President Jimmy Carter considered advancing legislation on national health reform. It did not happen significantly. The next major effort was in the early 1990s when Bill Clinton became president in 1993. With his wife, the First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, they made a major effort to achieve a significant comprehensive overhaul of the U.S. healthcare system, not just health insurance, but healthcare delivery as well. And their efforts were part of an intense national conversation that went on for about 18 months and ended in the fall of 1994, and virtually nothing happened as a result. Except for one thing. There were lessons that were learned from the Clinton failure that were deeply learned and informative to the people who took the leadership role, both members and staff in Congress in 2009 as we started the next episode of health reform. But that's getting ahead. Let's look at what were some of the lessons that we learned over this century of efforts around health reform that were brought into the exercise in 2009 and 2010 that resulted in the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The key lessons were these. Number one is that to achieve something as large and important as national health reform, presidential leadership is absolutely essential. The president has to be personally involved, not so much in the weeds, but in presenting to the nation the essential needs. Why we have to do this. The second key lesson was to act quickly before a new president's political capital dissipates. It's a common understanding that every day a president is in office, he or she has less political capital than they had the day before, and that it's a stream downward, and there's so much difficulty in achieving national health reform that it's essential to move early in administration rather than late. Third, the details of a legislative proposal should be left to Congress. The president needs to focus on the higher purpose, continuously educating the nation about why we're doing this and why it matters. Next is a belief that health reform has to be bipartisan. There has to be significant involvement by Republicans and Democrats. That was a firm belief in the start of the process leading to passage of the ACA. There's a constant need to communicate with the public, to educate the public. And the last lesson is it's important as we try to expand health insurance to Americans who don't have it or Americans who are threatened, not to threaten the existing coverage that people have as much as possible. That was a controversial lesson in the implementation of the ACA. It was also understood as a primary difference between the Obama presidency's efforts and the Clinton's efforts. Clinton attempted to change health care for everybody, and the Obama administration attempted to really fix the system for people who were left out. those were some of the key lessons that were taken into the exercise to try and pass what became known as the Affordable Care Act.